Can type 2 diabetes be reversed? And how exactly can we do it? This is the second part of the conversation with Roy Taylor, professor of medicine and metabolism at Newcastle University and one of the world's leading diabetologists. In the first video, we covered a lot of the basics. What is type 2 diabetes and what causes it? Check it out if you haven't yet. One thing that was emphasized was this idea of fat accumulation inside the organs, namely the liver and the pancreas, and how that can lead to metabolic dysfunction and eventually type 2 diabetes. And this concept comes up again throughout today's conversation, which focuses on reversal of type 2 diabetes. Is it possible? And actionable steps to do it. So here's the second part of my conversation with Professor Roy Taylor. So we covered how diabetes starts. Let's talk about how to end it. Because classically diabetes was typically seen as a chronic disease. When I was in medical training, we didn't talk about reversing diabetes, we were curing diabetes, we talked about managing it. But now it's becoming more mainstream, this idea that perhaps it is possible to turn back the clock.
Indeed, indeed.
So, yeah, what has science in general, and your work in particular, taught us about this? Can we reverse diabetes, or would you talk about remission instead? How would you phrase it? What do you think science has revealed?
Okay. Well, back in 2006, my own work had shown that the liver was quite fatty in diabetes, and also the fat in the liver was making the liver itself insulin resistant. Now, the liver controls the level of sugar in the blood, and if you're insulin resistant, the liver will be steadily putting out more and more sugar. And so, in first thing in the morning, you haven't eaten your breakfast, your sugar's going to be just that smidgen higher. So that came out of my work, but I knew about Roger Unger's studies from a long time ago and was wondering if it might be simply fat in the liver and fat in the pancreas that was causing all this. And so I played around with these ideas, and suddenly I saw that you could explain everything with a vicious cycle in the liver with the fat slowly building up that actually knocked on to have a vicious cycle in the pancreas with the fat building up, and eventually type 2 diabetes might arise. Well, that's a hypothesis, and the thing about a hypothesis is that scientists can set out to destroy it. That's what we have to do in science. You try and destroy a hypothesis. If you fail, then it might be right. So back in 2008, I managed to get funding to carry out a study, the Counterpoint study, which would test this, because the hypothesis predicted if we suddenly dropped the level of fat inside the organs, we'd be able to see this matter of the liver producing glucose going back to normal and the level of fat in the liver going down, and we'll be able to see the level of fat in the pancreas going down and the beta cells going back to normal. Now, it was felt to be an extremely unlikely hypothesis, but we went ahead and tested it, and I could not just believe the results we were getting. This was one of the most exciting studies I've ever run, because each person with type 2 diabetes would drop their fasting level of sugar to normal within 7 days. Now, how were we testing this hypothesis? Well, I've looked after people for a long time, and I know that they find it difficult to follow weight-reducing diets. But I also know the simplest way of achieving this, which is to use a low-calorie diet. So we used a diet that was approximately 700-800 calories. And we based it on a liquid formula diet for one simple reason. We're all human. And one of the difficulties of dieting is the choices. There's a cumulative burden that people carry trying to diet, and eventually it gets on top of them. So we made it simple. You have a packet for dinner, you have a packet for lunch, a packet for breakfast. You can choose the flavor, but it's just a packet. And then, because life isn't about metabolism alone, we need to keep the gut happy, we got them to eat some non-starchy vegetables, things like salad stuff, lettuce, cucumber, mushrooms, tomatoes, these very low-calorie foodstuffs to keep the gut right, and also because people like chewing on things. Now, I'd thought it was going to be a real struggle to get our noble volunteers to stick to this. But one of the astounding things we found in this study, which used the diet for 8 weeks, just 8 weeks to test our hypothesis, was that people told us that, in fact, after the first day or two, it wasn't difficult. Now, I was amazed because I thought that most of my energy and most of the energy of my team would go at helping people stick to the diet. No, they lost 33 pounds on average. And that's amazing in 8 weeks. In the first week, they'd lost approximately 8 pounds in weight. So the sudden drop in intake of food had allowed the body to do what the body does best. That is, use the most appropriate food to carry on living. And the most appropriate food that's at hand is the fat in the liver. In terms of handling money, you've got your deposit account in the bank, but you've got your current account. Well, liver fat's a current account. So that gets drawn on straight away. The liver fat fell from a very high level down to the same level as people without diabetes in 7 days. And by 8 weeks, it was way down at a very low level. So we knew that the one half of the twin cycle hypothesis was correct.
Okay, quick note, the twin cycle hypothesis is this idea that there's a cycle of events in the liver leading to fat accumulation in that organ, and then in parallel there's a cycle of events in the pancreas leading to fat accumulation there. And together, this chain of events leads to type 2 diabetes. See the first video for more details on that, and back to Professor Roy Taylor.
The change in the pancreas was much more subtle. It happened very slowly and gradually over 8 weeks. And what happened was the level of fat in the pancreas gradually went down and the insulin producing cells woke up. It was absolutely eye-popping data. And when we published this in the main European Diabetes Journal, it became the most cited paper for over 2 years. And people were extremely excited. So reversing type 2 diabetes was on the map. Now, as part of the question, you asked me reversing or remission. What's going? Well, reversing is the process of getting from one place to another. If you want to put your car into a parking lot, you might reverse it in. Now, it doesn't imply anything about the future because you're going to drive it forwards out later. And indeed, having reversed the diabetes by weight loss, if people put the weight back on, the diabetes would come back again. In fact, that caused some experts to say, well, it's not really gone away at all, has it? But we needed to test that by doing our second study that asked the question about remission, because remission has got a durability to the word. And we did the same again, but with a much larger number of people, and we followed them up for this study for 6 months. And in the Counterbalance study, we dropped the weight about 14 kilograms, and then we kept it absolutely steady just by very ordinary advice. People were encouraged to eat what kinds of foods that they were happy eating, but not too much of them. So weight stable. And what happened was the people with short duration diabetes, that is under about 10 years, would usually go back to normal and absolutely stay there. The insulin producing cells would wake up and they'd be very frisky again. But people with long duration diabetes, and we had some people with up to 23 years duration, they seem to be different. And in fact, when we looked at the tests at the start, they had insulin producing cells that were actually rock bottom. So it is possible to have had diabetes for too long and you can't wake up your beta cells. But we were able to prove this concept of remission. And that was in a small study, of course, inside a research center. But that led us on, as you know, to go out into the general population and see if we could do the same thing in ordinary office-based care for diabetes, which is where most of the diabetes care happens. And so we did that, and we found it was entirely possible just with 8 hours tuition. And we demonstrated that this was practical, possible, and we can achieve remission of type 2 diabetes. And that remission appears to last as long as people keep their weight down. They can put on a bit of weight often, but if they cross their personal fat threshold, 100% type 2 diabetes will come back.
Okay, another quick note. The personal fat threshold is this idea that everybody's got their own individual threshold for fat storage, above which metabolic issues arise and eventually type 2 diabetes. And the personal fat threshold can vary a lot. Some people can be very resilient to carrying excess fat and have a very high threshold and be overweight and still not cross it, while others can have a lower threshold and cross it while still looking relatively lean. Hence, personal fat threshold. Check the first video for more details on that. And now, back to Professor Roy Taylor.
So we are in a position of clarity here. It's a simple matter, and that's not the same as saying that it's easy.
Right.
But for any one person, yes, we can be pretty sure of our ground now and put over this message of simplicity and try and make it as easy as possible for our individual patients.
The adherence that you mentioned is fascinating because this is a common complaint in the weight loss field that sometimes you can get weight loss with all kinds of diets, but then keeping the weight off is the hardest part. But you mentioned people were very motivated to do it. Do you think that's because they saw those initial dramatic results and they were galvanized to keep doing it? Do you think it's something specific about the intervention? And do you think this would be transferable to somebody who's not in the setting of a study, but who is at home and just following the advice?
I can answer that last point very definitely, because one thing that happened after we published our very first study in 2011 was that I got this vast tsunami of emails coming in from people initially asking how to do it. So we put all the information on our website, but then a second tsunami of people telling us how it was for them and what had happened. And we were able to write up a series of these people. There were over 70 who provided sufficiently detailed information for us to be able to be sure of what we were saying. And yes, these people did it in their own homes without any input from doctors or nurses. And they were able to demonstrate that, yes, if someone is determined enough, they can do it. And that's a really important message because this is all about empowerment, empowerment of people who've got various health conditions. Yes, this is a matter of putting knowledge into people's hands, and that's an exciting process.
I love that. So let's put some more knowledge in people's hands. Maybe we can start another tsunami right here. If we can give people actionable tips, because this is what we're all about here. Somebody who's sitting at home watching this and thinking, I have diabetes, established type 2 diabetes, and I'm motivated to do it. Can you give a simple roadmap, maybe bullet points, however you think is appropriate? How can somebody go from their current state of diabetes to achieve that goal of remission?
Right. That's a really important point. The first point is this person needs to think, do they really want to do this? You know, this is a tough few weeks to do it in this sort of fashion, but the gains are huge. Do they really want to do it? And if the answer is yes, then there's a second really important point that's often completely ignored. They've got to discuss it with their family, with their nearest and dearest, because individuals don't diet. Doctors should realize this. Don't send an individual to a dietitian. You need to send at least the spouse pair or the closest people in the family who are connected with the cooking, because we're social eaters and we eat in social groups. We tend to eat similarly to those around us. And if we're going to do something radically different for 8, 12 weeks, whatever, then we've got to have people to support us. And it's one thing we learned in our very first study, that we had 2 dropouts from the study, and both of them had dropped out for the same reason. Their spouse did not want them to lose more weight.
Sabotage.
Now,
Yeah.
that might, yes, indeed, sabotage. That might seem curious to many people. Why wouldn't someone want your nearest and dearest to lose? Well, you choose your spouse, and sometimes you like them because of who they are, and that's a wonderful thing, a very warm human thing. But that may also encompass body size, and we have to recognize this because we're dealing with real life. There's real people, and so having your nearest and dearest on board is probably the most overlooked and important aspects to consider in starting that. So we've got the decision, we've got the family, and then next, okay, how are you going to do it? Well, there are various ways of doing it. In our research, and the simplest way of doing this is to lose weight over a defined short period of time, because you only need to set aside 2 months to get off your 33 pounds. That'll be a tough few months, but at least it's just that. Now, if you do that, it needs to be a low calorie diet, it needs to be easy. And so, yes, using substitute meals, liquid formula meals, is a good way of doing this, but it's not the only way. Some people have done it extremely well, and in fact, it was half of the original group that wrote into me. Half the group had done it by just cooking smaller meals for themselves, about 800 calories a day. The other half had done it with the liquid formula diet. Again, it's a choice. It's a bit like a condition, and yet you say it's only an operation that can cure me, otherwise it'll be fatal. But isn't there any other way? The doctor would say, no, if you want to survive this cancer, you've got to have the operation, you've got to take 2 months off work, another month maybe taking it easy. Yes, okay, we'd all do that to get over this and expect that there's a treatment period and then we're through it. And that's exactly what we're doing. We're saying, look, just grasp this nettle. We're talking about 2 months you have to give up to lose sufficient weight to be able to get underneath your personal fat threshold. And so it becomes a feasible thing. It's not like a death of 1,000 hungry days of the sort of steady, low calorie approach, which many people find difficult, but I wouldn't dismiss out of hand because some people do it, and that's fine. So it's not important that you lose weight fast, but you have to recognize that losing weight over a short period of time fast is one of the simplest ways of achieving the goal.
Okay, I think it was pretty clear there, but just to emphasize, because people can get very sensitive when we talk about different diets, the low-calorie diet is the way they did it, very successfully. And some of the people they worked with also did portion control. So it's important to know those things worked. In a research setting supervised by a research team, it's important to know those things can work. They're an option on the table. It's also important to realize they're not the only options in the world. It's very possible for something to work for a lot of people, even the majority of people, and for it not to work very well for me. It doesn't mean that the science is wrong, it just means we're not all the same. The key is to lose that extra weight, that excess fat mass. So if a low-fat diet, or a low-carb diet, or a high-carb diet, or whatever works for you, great, do that. This is why we'll see people fighting online all the time, where one says, my diet improved my diabetes, and the other says, well, my diet is completely different from yours, and it improved my diabetes, so you must be wrong. The main factor is losing that excess fat mass. So any diet that helps with weight loss will generally improve glucose metabolism. I'm not saying that weight loss is the only thing that matters in a diet. Don't get me wrong. I'm saying that when you experience substantial weight loss, In general, your fasting blood glucose drops as well, regardless of macronutrient composition. Okay, moving on.
To be specific on the amount, because there is this personal fat threshold, the amount of weight people are going to lose, the absolute mass is going to differ from individual to individual. How can they know how much they need to lose, and how can they know when they're done?
I can offer a good rule of thumb. If people lose about 33 pounds, they are highly likely to get underneath their personal fat threshold. There is an absolute amount, which is quite a simple rule of thumb. This is not about obesity. Obesity is a completely separate issue that's defined by this curious cutoff of a BMI of 30. Has that got any biological reality? Well, no, but of course it's a good way of expressing risk. But if we come down to the individual, it's all over the place. And so almost everybody needs to lose 33 pounds to reliably get rid of the diabetes. Although I would point out there's a little exception, because people who've got type 2 diabetes but are quite light are often likely to do quite well with just losing approximately 25 pounds. And in terms of percentage body weight, that would be about the same, about 15% body weight. So there is a simple guideline there. The people who start off at a very heavy weight with type 2 diabetes have probably developed their diabetes from about 33 pounds down upwards. The same for the people who've achieved a body weight of 140 pounds. Well, they've come up as well. So you see, there is again a simplicity. It's not about judging people by their weight. This is nowhere near fat shaming. This has nothing to do with obesity. This is a matter of recognizing that an individual's body has become too heavy for them.
That makes sense. And if somebody didn't have full-blown diabetes yet, but had maybe insulin resistance or had pre-diabetes, would the process be the same, but maybe just a more modest amount of weight loss would do?
Precisely. So people who've been told they've got pre-diabetes, hey, the writing's on the wall. The risk of heart disease, premature heart disease, is already max. They've got other risks, and you've got to do something about it. But the solution is just the same. But instead of talking of 33 pounds, we're talking more like 22 pounds, possibly even 20 pounds. A distinct amount of weight has got to come down. And if people say, whoa, that's too much weight to lose, I would pull them up short and say, hang on, how heavy were you when you'd finished growing, when you were 18, 20? And they'd come out with some figure. It's very salutary to realize that gain of weight above that weight is all fat mass that's been accumulated.
Unless it's a bodybuilder or something, but it's going to be unusual.
Unless there are some unusual circumstances, precisely. So that's the approach for pre-diabetes. For insulin resistance, that's quite interesting, because some people can live with insulin resistance and apparently not have any adverse consequences from it. But if a person comes from a family in whom some people have got type 2 diabetes, if they come from an ethnic minority group, then they are much more likely with that insulin resistance to being pushed down the road towards pre-diabetes. And also for those women who've had gestational diabetes, a poorly understood condition, but that too is just a signal that the type 2 diabetes process is potentially underway. So for all of those people, yes, the writing's on the wall, bring the weight down and just enjoy that health.
Next, we talked about exercise, and Roy Taylor's recommendations on that actually surprised me a lot.
So we've talked about diet, we've talked about fat mass. Exercise, what role does it play, if any? Is it important?
Well, physical activity is important in general. It helps us feel well. Certainly, it can provide some cardiovascular benefits, but there's a really important caveat that I need to nail, and that is when people start trying to lose weight, it's really important they don't start a new exercise program. Let's just sit back and consider the person who's developed type 2 diabetes. They are not usually in the first flush of youth. They're not usually very light. And these heavy, somewhat older people find it very difficult to do enough exercise to make a meaningful difference to calorie balance. It's not to say that some people can't do it. No, no. It's just to point out that if you want to lose weight, cut the food. Do not try and exercise it away once you're beyond the age of maybe 30. So compensatory eating is a consequence of starting an exercise program. You know, there are zillions of people who've joined a gym, start training, and they're really disappointed because their weight doesn't drop. And we know from very careful studies that there's an unconscious tendency to increase the calorie intake. So these people are burning more calories, but they're not realizing it, but they're taking in more. So
Reward after the
please
workout.
don't do
deserve this.
exercise to lose weight, but just drop your food intake when you get to your target weight. That's when it would be entirely appropriate to start playing football with your grandchildren, to start chasing them up the stairs, to walk much further every morning. So long term, physical activity is a really important component of this enormously difficult problem of keeping weight down long term. And all of the studies that have looked at this have shown just how important it is, yes, to restrain what you eat, but to maintain some increased activity. So it is really important, but at the right time.
So just to clarify, during that intense phase of weight loss, maintain the level of activity from before. If somebody's already exercising, you don't need to stop necessarily. Maintain perhaps, but don't try to go crazy on the exercise. It's not the exercise that's going to give you the most bang for your buck in terms of weight loss. It's the dietary tweaks.
That's absolutely correct. So it's exactly as you say, and the amount of exercise people do is very variable. Of course, it's part of being an individual, and they should just continue doing what they usually do. It's a change in food intake alone that's going to produce the goods. Ideally, they would increase their exercise level. I should say their physical activity level. It doesn't have to be exercise. It can just be walking an extra bus stop or always using the stairs and never the elevator. So it's that kind of change in activity, physical activity, long term, which can help.
This has been incredible, really fascinating for me, and I'm sure really informative for my audience. If people want to know more about you, about your work, about diabetes in general, where can they go?
They can go to my website, and I can give you that to put up on the screen, but also they can actually buy a simple book that's written for people with diabetes as well as health professionals. And that's available in the States. I just happen to have a copy here. It's called Life Without Diabetes. And this isn't a commercial plug because all the profits go to Diabetes UK that actually awarded me that grant in 2008 that allowed the whole business of diabetes remission to get off the ground. So the book contains all the information necessary, but the website has got the basic nuggets of information on. So, yep, the info's there, and this puts the power into the hands of the people who need it.
And I recently read your book, and it's fascinating. It covers the history, all your studies, this whole progression. And what's really interesting, it covers kind of the backstage of how the ideas came about, and which we often don't get to hear that side of science. We get to see the end result, but that was really fascinating to read.
So often today, science is viewed as a matter of collecting huge amounts of data and describing large numbers. But in fact, we need to reflect that the most important studies of history have been on very small numbers of people. Remember insulin and type 1 diabetes? How many people? One. That young chap called Leonard Thomas, when he got his first injection of insulin. Wow, it was illuminating. The same with penicillin for meningococcal meningitis. So,
Mm,
the really important frame shifts of knowledge
mm,
are with small numbers, such as we've been able to do for this, the commonest metabolic disease of man and woman.
mm. Thank you so much for all your work, and thanks for taking the time to talk to us.
My pleasure, Gil.
And,
Bye bye.
have a great day.